So I'm going to try and, I work with the Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities. And so one thing I wanted you to know is I will give an update kind of where the advocates are. You've heard a little bit about Medicaid. So I'm glad to hear that that's come up because that's actually really topical right now. And so just know that my opinions are my own or in the advocacy work that I do with national organizations related to federal policy. And, you know, we all have, like, we're all somewhere in this process. So I just fully want to respect that. But it is a very political time, these issues that we're going to talk about tonight. Um, for the first time in my career, I've never heard special ed mentioned so much from the beginning of an administration. So, for good or bad, that's where we are. And we're trying to make sure it's for good. So let's jump in really quickly. I wanted you to know what's happening on Capitol Hill right now, just because this will help frame what some of the big issues are and what the timing is around them. And I'm just doing a sound check. I'm getting a little, are we okay for sound? I'm just doing a little tech check. We're okay. All right,
Yep.
I'll keep going. So I'm going to talk a little bit about and remind everybody what the appropriations process actually looks like, but just know that is top of mind in the House. They've already kicked off their season to begin to figure out our next federal budget. And remember, our fiscal year runs through September 30. So we're just more than halfway through FY25, and then FY26 begins October 1. And so they're beginning to have the discussions to pass the appropriations bills. Money is a very contentious discussion, and we're seeing that at home as well. Sounds like we need to, do more to advocate for the money that we need at home, but the same thing's happening in the Congress. There is one thing I wanted to flag, and the reason I put this first, for the first time with this proposal, which I am going to talk more about, but there's a proposal to shut down the Department of Ed and to move IDEA over to HHS, the Health and Human Services Agency, where some of the aging and disability programs are, but there's really nothing over there but Medicaid related to children with disabilities. And so with this proposal, for the first time, we're hearing that in the appropriations process, they could add something called a policy writer and try and go through the back door to amend our laws to have HHS be the agency of authority over IDEA versus the Department of Education, which is what the statute mandates right now. We do not like this proposal in the advocacy work that I do. And so that's why I put it here. I just want you to know there's this potential that they could use this policy writer in appropriations, and we don't want that to happen. We'll talk more about it, but I wanted you to understand it's very time sensitive because the House is going to try and pass their bills before the end of July. Now, the Senate will take longer, but just know that we really don't want that proposed anywhere because those bills are so political. Remember, it's in the Labor, Health, and Human Services bill where all the education money is. This is like the biggest bill that comes through of all the appropriations bills that Congress passes. And we don't want basically our little issue, which is a big issue to us, but it would be small in the context of that huge bill. We don't want it in there. The next big thing, and actually the thing they're going to start talking about next week, they're coming back to it, is this budget reconciliation package. And this is where Medicaid is at great risk. This is the bill that when a party, and it's the Republicans right now, when they control the House, the Senate, and the White House, they can use a budget mechanism and pass a big budget bill. Now they have to find what they're called pay-fors if they're going to extend these tax extensions for corporations and others. And the pay-for that is under on the table is Medicaid to the tune of like $880 billion. It's a lot of money. And if you know of or your child is eligible for Medicaid, this is going to directly impact access to Part C services for early intervention. More than half the children eligible under Part C are Medicaid eligible as well. And it will also affect school-based, for when parents consent to those school-based services that children receive. So that just gives you the frame for like the next 8 weeks in Congress. These are the two big things that are under discussion. Okay, I want to also just bring a couple of things up that I want to make sure we do some baseline around kind of the facts. Part B of IDEA, and this is the big grants to states, Section 611. This is the big bucket of money that provides the funding for kids age 5 to 21 to our states and school districts. It's permanently authorized. That means if Congress never wanted to examine IDEA, they do not have to. There is no requirement to go back in and examine or open up IDEA for some kind of look. Now, there are things we'd like to change, but in this political climate, we do not want it opened. And it's sometimes confusing because this IDEA sits in a different category than other education laws. It doesn't have that same timestamp on it. And this has become a point of contention with the DOGE folks that are here, the Department of Government Efficiency folks, and others who are trying to claim that if your law isn't authorized, then we're not going to fund it. So I want to make it really clear, Part B of IDEA is permanently authorized. And in addition to that, our regulations sit inside the statute and are codified within the law. Most of them sit in the statute, and very few requirements under IDEA actually sit outside of the statute. Having said that, Part C, which we all care about, is not permanently authorized, and Part D, the national activities that we care greatly about, are also not permanently authorized, but the big bucket is. Another big thing I just want to clarify is that, this executive order that's come out, and I'll show it to you in a minute, but there is this, call to dismantle the Department of Ed. But just know that all of the education laws, whether they're authorized or not, they're still the law of the land, and they all require the Secretary of Education to oversee for IDEA its fiscal and program requirements. There's requirements under in the Rehab Act for Section 504 for the Department of Education to collect data and to perform the functions to protect students from discrimination in K to 16 schools, and then also monitor and oversee compliance with ESEA, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Our states and districts get a huge chunk of money for Title I in our low-income schools and districts under ESEA. So I just want to make it really clear that unless Congress changes those requirements, the Secretary of Education is still required to perform those functions. So an executive order does not change these requirements, only Congress can do so. And you've heard Secretary McMahon say, and she's acknowledged that Congress has to decide to do what she and the president have proposed. So Congress has to make the changes. And the big thing that you need to know that gives me a little bit of comfort is in the terms of doing this work is that in the Senate, it would take 60 votes to make this happen. You have to have more than a majority in the Senate. You have to have 60, and they only have 53 votes. The Republicans have a majority with 53. They would have to convince at least 7 Democrats to come with them on a vote to change any of these essential requirements that are in our statutes. But this whole discussion around education funding to get the federal government out of funding any programs, I'm going to put a pin in whether that applies to IDEA or not. But this has become extremely partisan, as you can see in the news. And it's the first time where we know we have champions in both parties of IDEA, but unfortunately, some of our Republican colleagues are really having to stay quiet right now because they don't want to be speaking publicly against something that the president wants. All right, just a quick reminder. I probably don't need to go through this with you. You're experts, but I always try and remind everybody on Capitol Hill, there are authorizers and there are appropriators. And so authorizers make the laws, and I'm going to show you who these people are right now, and then appropriators fund those laws. Authorizers get to recommend levels. Remember, IDEA is recommended in the law that districts receive 40% of the per pupil expense of the excess cost of special education. And we're currently appropriating, the appropriators are giving 10% of that 40. So we've never met that requirement in the authorizing law. Appropriators get to decide how much to fund all of the laws, and they don't have to do what the authorizers recommend. Is there a question?
Yes.
Okay.
We have a question in the chat from Aaron. Is there a way to make Part C permanently authorized in the same way as Part B?
It's a really good question. There is, Congress would need to do that, which means it would have to be opened up and examined through the authorizing process in a committee markup, go to the floor, get passed, et cetera, et cetera. So we really don't want it to be examined right now in that way, but there is a way to do it in the future, and that is to have Congress, permanently authorize it. It's a really good question. I wish they'd done it for all of them, but they were passed at different times, and so they're not they're not looked at in the same scope and sequence together. Okay, so I've already talked about budget reconciliation, but I wanted you to see, in addition to appropriations, over here where I've told you Congress is going to focus their time now to get our budget settled somewhere by the end of the year. You know how this goes. They just passed the FY25 bill in March. If you didn't know that, March 14th was the date they finalized FY25. It can take a while. But they're really focused on this budget reconciliation bill. This is the exception to all things having to fall under an appropriation bill. They can have this budget measure, and they are in the process of trying to reconcile the House and the Senate versions of the budget packages. And, the president wanted one big bill. The Senate said, no, maybe we'll do two. Now they're both back to doing one. So they're going to come back next week, and they're really trying to figure out how do they deal with this funding shortfall. And there are very specific rules to budget reconciliation that are different from our other spending bills. And that is, they focus on our mandatory spending. It's focused on the revenue side of our budget, and they have to use funds that come through mandatory spending. And that is not IDEA or ESEA. Those are all called discretionary spending. And so when they're looking for ways to pay for things to change our tax code, et cetera, they have to find cuts either through Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and there are a handful of education programs like Pell Grants and some of the student loan programs where they could scrape a little money out there, but they have to look at only the mandatory side. This is what appropriations looks like right now. I just wanted to give you a finer point. Right now, we're in the process in the House where they are taking testimony. So, for example, Fairfax County is taking their testimony tonight on their budget. The Congress is doing the same thing. They're taking public testimony. Members of Congress are submitting their priorities. And there are deadlines in the House for all of this to occur in the Appropriations Committee. And then they will begin to write their bills. We're also waiting. You can see that big red arrow. The president has not provided a budget recommendation to Congress yet for all of the federal programs. I'm wondering if you saw some news. Somebody leaked a document related to Health and Human Services where big cuts are being proposed, we think, in the budget that would eliminate Head Start, for example. It would also eliminate all of the disability and many of the aging programs that are over at HHS. And this has many of us very nervous about what the president will propose to Congress. But remember, the president's budget is a suggestion, and Congress does ultimately decide, and they will have to negotiate this. Oh, I meant to tell you this. Budget reconciliation does not require the 60 votes in the Senate. You only need the majority vote. But for appropriations, you have to have the 60 votes in the Senate. And so that does make the appropriations process trickier because the Senate tends and needs to work in a more bipartisan fashion in order to get those bills across the finish line. So these are our appropriators. I just wanted you to see who the lead decision makers are for education. It's in what's called the Labor, Health and Human Services Subcommittee. We call it Labor H for short. Mr. Adderholt is the chair of the subcommittee that oversees all of the health, human services, education, and related agencies, all of those things. It's a massive bill in one. There's a full subcommittee related to the bill. His ranking is Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut. She's also the ranking on the full Appropriations Committee. And so she's a long-term appropriator, as is he. He's been there about 6 or 8 years. But she's been there, I don't know, I think my entire career, a really long time, over 20 years. In the Senate, in the subcommittee, we have Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia and Tammy Baldwin, and they work together pretty well. The committee staff that work on appropriations are experts and tend to not get bogged down in kind of the politics, but of course they have some really tricky decisions to make. There are competing priorities between the House and the Senate. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I want you to know that, of course, Republicans want to scale back spending, and that has been a goal for many years. And there's a lot of course, tension in ways to cut back on spending in our federal budget. And they have produced bills that have cut and eliminated many education programs, but to date, we've not seen a proposal that would cut IDEA. Now, they do tend to flat fund IDEA, and the Democrats did that too, to be fair, for the 2 years that they were in control under President Biden in the House. They also just flat funded IDEA. So, I did put a note on here I want you to be aware of. For the first time in my career, there was an appropriations hearing about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and Mr. Harris from Maryland, he's a very conservative member. He's chair of the Freedom Caucus in the House. He went over an open mic and said to the witnesses on the panel, I want to hear why you think it's a bad idea to block grant Title I and to block grant IDEA. It's the first time I've heard IDEA mentioned in the same sentence for block granting. And that's very worrisome that it's like okay to talk about block granting our money, which would mean you would separate IDEA from its requirements. Block grant is basically giving the states the money and saying, you go figure it out. Like we have a shell of a law, you've got to do stuff, but we're not going to monitor and ensure that you comply with the law. That's what block granting is, and it's very worrisome. Is there a question?
There is. Do we see any concerns regarding the autism community, given that some of the headlines this week have been a bit terrifying for the autism
Yes,
community?
there are deep concerns, and I'm happy to follow up an email. There have been public statements, letters that have been signed, both like a big statement came out from all the autism groups together, and then they allowed national organizations to be what they called endorsers of the statement, if that makes sense. And so there was this big push to get that done late last week on the heels of the first round of comments. And then today, more has happened. And so there is an effort to really try and counteract and push back on some of the myths, the stigmatism. I made one of the first comments I've made on LinkedIn about how horrifying it really is. Like this feels like we're in 1925, not 2025, in terms of how we're supporting the research, best practice, understanding the full spectrum, right? I mean, there's just so many things here, but there is a push in the community to work together on that and to also help members of Congress know how to sort through fact from fiction.
I
Any
do
other
also want
questions?
to add, as SEPTA leadership, we have sent a letter to National PTA's Vice President of Advocacy. Following up on this issue, we are in the process of creating our own local statement, but we have requested to put the issue before National PTA's representatives as to whether or not they would be willing to sign on to that autism organization statement that was released last week, or if they'd be willing to make their own standalone statement.
That's good to know, Amanda. I know that they're part of CCD. I'm a co-chair with the Education Task Force, and they're active with us. I do think they struggle with the membership to sign on to everything with us because we do take a very firm, very strong position in the advocacy community in CCD around. We've said no to dismantling ed. We've said no to moving IDEA to HHS. Some groups just aren't there, like in terms of their ability to get to be that strident with their position. And I don't know, I haven't seen the PTA yet on our letters this year.
I
But
don't know if they've joined onto yours. I do know that National PTA has put out its own advocacy calls for not dismantling the Department of
oh,
Ed.
good. That's great to
Um,
hear. I haven't paid
yes.
attention. I'm glad to hear that. That's
Yep.
great. Um,
And then we have one other question that came in. What happens if federal funding does not occur and states are required to provide services under IDEA?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So what happens, and I actually just talked to my colleague over at the Council for Chief State School Officers. They're the state chiefs in every state, they have a national organization. And I said to him, I said, what is happening with, like, tell me, make sure how are you assured the money's going to flow was my question. Because for the first time, I've just never really questioned the money would flow. But in fact, the money is required to flow, and states draw down their money in July for IDEA and Title I and in October. And so the next drawdown for a school would be in July, and they are funded through FY25 appropriations to draw down their IDEA funding. So there should be no problem getting into the school. We call that forward funding. There should be no problem for states to be able to allocate money to districts, and they know what the funding level is. Now, there's no increases, and that's why the county's probably stressed out. They've been flat funded in IDEA now for the third fiscal year in a row. So that's 3 years. And as our numbers go up, and with inflation, it's a cut, right? A flat funding is not when you don't get an increase and you've got more kids and more needs. And then I heard your whole discussion about, how we have shortages and all the other things we have going on in special ed that are challenging. We need more money, but they do know how much money they have for FY25. Moving into October, it could get a little bit dicier, except I know states plan for, and in the case of Congress, passes what's called a continuing resolution, and they will at least flat fund at the same level to get us into the fall timeframe, unless the president decides to just say, shut it all down. He's done that in the past, and that could affect how money flows to districts if that did happen in October. Does that help?
Yes,
Okay.
I think so. If I see anything follow up, I'll let you know.
All right. I wanted to see who our authorizers are because we have 2 new chairs. In the House, it's Mr. Tim Walberg from Michigan, and in the Senate, we have Bill Cassidy, who's a physician. Some of you know him. I know some of you are really involved in the dyslexia work. He is an advocate for dyslexia, and he is the new chair in the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in the Senate. We know that he's going to put literacy somewhere at the forefront of his agenda. We don't know exactly how yet. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to skip over Bobby Scott from Virginia. You probably recognize him. He's been a long-term either chair or ranking of this committee in the House Education and Workforce Committee, civil rights attorney, strident advocate, and then Bernie Sanders, who I think you know his reputation. Something Senator Sanders did that you might be interested in that we thought was really amazing. About 3 weeks ago, he released a report on what's happening with all the cuts over at the Office for Civil Rights. And his report documents that 46 million children are at risk of having discrimination or other restraint, seclusion, other things happening to them without the Office for Civil Rights to be able to do their job. Oh, I need to go this way. Sorry. In the House of Representatives, Mr. Walberg has indicated with Mr. Scott that they want to reauthorize the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act. This is our big employment law. Now, young adults with disabilities are included in WIOA under Title IV, which is vocational rehabilitation. And so when they debated this bill 2 years ago and came out with a very solid draft, they did not alter Title IV of WIOA, which is voc rehab, and we don't want them to. There are some good requirements in there that we don't want tinkered with, and there are Republicans that want to take them out, which would include new requirements in the last 7 or 8 years to have competitive integrated employment be a requirement of voc rehab. Even our state of Virginia and others it's taken time for them to figure out how to develop pathways to competitive integrated employment. And we don't want that stopped. We want that momentum to continue. But WIOA would be on their list. We all were discouraged about a week ago when Mr. Walberg said publicly that he would consider changing the IDEA law to let them move it to HHS. We didn't like that he said that. When he first took his job in January, he said he thought it would be really difficult to move IDEA to HHS. I actually had a quote on this slide that I had to take off today because he has changed his tune. And you can see that these are Republicans are very aware of the president's agenda and the power that he has. Members of Congress only get to run for 2-year terms, and there is a great risk of the president running someone against them, and they don't want that to happen. And that this is the climate that we're in, is trying to make the president happy, but also figuring out, and we're going to make sure they have to listen to us too. So, another question?
Yep. Um, Talking about going back to the OCR comments.
Yep.
This person knows that knows a teacher who's received an answer from OCR attorneys after the news told us it shut down. What's the latest regarding OCR? If parents need to report things regarding IEPs, should they stick to state complaints for right now?
They should do both. So OCR is not shut down, but half of the regional offices were. I'm going to show you a slide with some of those numbers in a minute, but they are still open for business, and we need to make sure they stay open for business. So do both. And COPAA, the organization that I work with, actually has a lawsuit suing the Department of Education and Linda McMahon for the decisions that have been made related to the cases that they aren't wanting to examine and explore. So they have plaintiffs in that case who've come forward whose complaints have been put on hold because of the intersection of disability with gender, with race, with LGBTQ status, etc. And so, I would just say file both. We need OCR to know that they need to function, and they've been appropriated money to run OCR as OCR should be run. So we want them to continue to do that. In the Senate, I talked about Bill Cassidy. We don't really know his agenda quite yet. We know he said that he wants to support the anti-Semitism agenda that is part of both the House and the Senate education discussion. He is putting a hearing together, I understand, on the NAEP. That's our National Assessment of Educational Progress. We all know that it's a cohort of students with disabilities that take that test. While it does reflect somewhat how kids with disabilities are doing, we know that those kids kind of get cherry picked sometimes who takes the NAEP. But NAEP is really important in terms of it's the only test we have where you can compare from state to state how kids are doing in reading, math, and science in 4th and 8th grade. And I'm a big proponent of NAEP. I heard some of you talking about literacy. I used to do a lot of work with the National Center for Learning Disabilities, and we actually helped early in my career, NCLD and others worked to make sure NAEP included students with IEPs and students with 504s, because they used to only include students with 504 plans. But now they have both. So, okay, I'm not going to go back into these dynamics, but I want you to just know the House operates differently than the Senate, and it's procedurally, we have to pay attention to how that works, because that 3-vote margin that Republicans hold isn't big enough to get them across the finish line on most bills, except for that reconciliation package. And so a lot of deal making goes on in the Senate because they need these 60 votes. And then, the Republicans have a very tiny margin in the House, and they struggle when it comes to the bigger issues because their moderates don't always want, and their very conservative groups don't want to always go with what the speaker is trying to do. So it's an interesting year that we're in related to the dynamics. Okay, I'm going to move into the administration. We've already touched on some of this, but I wanted you to see that there are several, of course, funding priorities and then an education agenda that the Trump administration has brought into play. The executive orders, I have a list of those in a minute, so we can talk through those. But this whole goal, and this carries into this is the second round for President Trump. In his first administration, they were very focused, Secretary DeVos at the time, to try and find a way to fund universal school choice with vouchers. It's very difficult because of the way our statutes are written to free up that money. And those of us that are proponents for kids with disabilities do not support federal funding going toward these programs. I want to make that really clear, because when I speak to other groups that, live in states where they have these programs, some parents of kids with disabilities really want them, and they actually don't mind foregoing their IDEA rights. But we really believe, it undercuts the funding that's available to our public schools, and 90% of kids with disabilities go to public school, and we need that money for those schools to support. We need both Title I and IDEA sitting next to each other, because that supports our kids in the general education classroom, and then they get their supports and services through IDEA. And we don't want those monies used for school choice programs. So that's a shared, we share that goal with the unions and with the superintendents, and we hold hands with groups we don't always sing kumbaya with on this thing related to the money. We know that they are withholding funds related to their agenda on race, sexual orientation, gender identity, anti-Semitism, etc. That is actually very much what's going on with OCR in terms of the investigations that they're launching. And then this week, we've seen the proposal to eliminate Head Start, disability research, advocacy, and the aging programs over in HHS. So there's a lot on the table and a lot at stake across the continuum of our community of disabled individuals. Secretary McMahon has basically said she's on point with the president. She wants to support his agenda. She didn't know what IDEA stood for about 2 or 3 weeks ago, so we're hoping she's figured that out now that she's over there functioning her job. And she has acknowledged it would take Congress to actually, allow her to move IDEA out of ed and move it somewhere else. And then they've got to deal with all the other education programs as well. And those are also codified in their own statutes. One of the arguments, and well, it's not arguments, but one of our speaking message points around why we don't want IDEA moved, here's the executive order to do it. One of the reasons we don't want it moved is that going over to HHS puts us in a medical model. We just don't think that in the long run, we know things aren't perfect. I mean, believe me, we all know that. You know that. Having said that, though, putting our kids over in an agency, in a structure that's focused on a medical model where they're stripping out all the research, they are taking away the focus related to scientific inquiry. And it's most of HHS is focused on reimbursing states for Medicaid and Medicare. And we just don't see how that supports a continuum of educational services and access for kids with disabilities that leads to employment. And so we don't want IDEA ripped out of and away from the other laws that we've all worked over, 15, 20 years to have these laws aligned and have students with disabilities included in the Career Tech Ed law, included in the Higher Education Act, included in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in ways where it's cohesive and aligned to and supportive of kids with disabilities having educational outcomes. So we don't want IDEA ripped out of there. We just think it's a really bad idea. These are the list of the bills that have been introduced to move IDEA. So there are proposals in Congress. None of them have been given a hearing yet. But like I said, Chairman Wahlberg, we don't know, but he could maybe tolerate doing that. And then, like I said, there's also this technical mechanism over in the appropriations side where they could put a policy writer in. So we're having to monitor things on all levels very closely in ways we haven't had to do before. Excuse me. Any questions? Okay, I'm
I
just
have
gonna
not
go
seen
ahead.
any other questions come in.
Okay.
I shared in the chat PTA's positions on school choice and their take action for Department of Education.
Okay, great. Have they said no to vouchers? Remind me. I just haven't checked in with them lately. It doesn't matter.
Um,
I'll go look at it. I've looked. It's
yes, in general, overall, yes, they oppose private school choice and any systems that divert public funds to
yeah, well
private
that and
schools.
that's the important thing, right? Like if states want to use other monies, that's the how we're all trying to think about it. We know states have access to other money. And that, okay, that's good to know. I wanted you to see the other cuts at Ed, and then we'll get into the back into the OCR thing. There was this temporary freeze on all federal funding really early on in the Trump administration that did not affect IDEA. So I just want to make that really clear. They have not specifically touched IDEA yet. But here's what they have done. They canceled 900 million in education research contracts, which includes programs that support students with disabilities. One had the term transition in it because that's one of the terms in our law, right? We're supposed to help kids transition from middle school to high school, from high school to post-secondary ed, or to career training. And programs like that got canceled. And they're also going through and selectively deciding at the National Center for Special Education Research, NCSR it's called, what to keep and what to toss. And we just think that approach is flawed. There's not been an iterative process to think about what is the continuum of research that we need to continue to look at disability through various lenses and the supports that schools and districts still need to improve their interventions and supports. They terminated the teacher quality partnership grants. This is all the money. These programs in here in this third bullet, these are all the funds that are made available to teacher candidates to enter the classroom. My daughter actually did this and went into a charter school and taught for 3 years, and that's how she helped pay. Then she worked in the Title I school for 4 years, and and she got a little stipend, one of these grants, toward becoming a teacher. But those have all been canceled. So now states it's really the onus is specifically on states to figure out how to fund teacher preparation. There won't be these federal programs. And so far, they haven't touched our personnel money in Part D of IDEA. But we are very worried that that could be on the chopping block because, again, this administration doesn't want the federal government giving states anything with any requirements. And those personnel prep dollars come with the requirement that you will, help improve your pipeline of special educators and specialized personnel. And so we're watching that very closely. And then a whole bunch of open competitions got canceled. So it's to the, more than $1 billion on paper. Here are the cuts to the staff that someone had asked about OCR. So 7 of the 12, I'm going down into the bottom there. So they've cut 2,000 people at the Department of Ed and over total. And they also gave some people the buyout, and they also riffed some people, which is a reduction in force where they just terminated their position and gave them a severance. 7 of the 12 OCR offices around the country have been eliminated. Some of the emails I've seen from, attorneys that worked in these offices were heartbreaking. They knew they had open cases they were walking away from. And so I know I told you to go ahead and file, and you should, but just know we don't know when and how, but there's got to be some kind of like seize. Everything's just going to seize up because they do not have the staff to take care of the load. But we also think that helps us on the other side to be able to point out why they need to use the money that Congress has given them to run the OCR more efficiently and to have the staff that they need. One big thing that is a big concern to us related to the Office of Special Education and the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, OSERS and OSEP over in the Department of Ed. They eliminated all of the attorneys that had any expertise in the intersection, like over across all the education laws, how IDEA, is interpreted to look at independent evaluations. I'm making this up, but those dear colleague letters, when you get to write in and ask OSEP what their, interpretation of X, Y, or Z is, those attorneys are all gone. And so while we still have career staff there, we don't have the legal expertise and the knowledgeable people that understood case law, statute, and how states, are given a lot of flexibility in how they implement IDEA, and those intersections, what that interplay is, those attorneys are all gone. So that is a big worry and a way that they are getting ed without Congress approval. I'm down to my last slide, which I'm sure you're relieved to hear. But I've already mentioned a lot of this as I've gone along here. Really, here's our message in terms of what the community is saying and groups that I'm setting up on the Hill. Someone mentioned that you went on the Hill with the ARC et al. I heard that was a really great meeting, by the way, and I'm really glad they gave you some good training. We're basically saying we want the law upheld. We want to keep IDEA, all its programs and related laws at ed. We want to support and increase funding for all parts of IDEA. We've talked about Part B and Part C a little bit, but those Part D activities are really important. Personnel preparation is one I've mentioned. There's also the line for media and technology. If any of your children or the schools that you're working in are part of Bookshare, that's funded under the media and technology line of Part D. There's a whole bunch of technical assistance and dissemination that gets funded under Part D. And this money is vital. We need Part D to be funded as well. And then, of course, I've got the thing in here about Medicaid, and I'm sure you've got there are lots of ways to email Congress about Medicaid and to tell your story or to collect stories if you want. That's it from me, unless you have questions.
I just have a follow-up question on Part D, Laura. Part D also funds the parent training
Oh,
information
I
centers
can't
in
believe
each
I
state,
forgot
right?
that. Yes, absolutely. I'm so sorry. That is absolutely, it's actually its own line in Part D. Parent Training Information Centers, they are their own line. And yes, yeah. So I'm sorry, I forgot the PTI is essential.
So for those who might not know the PTI acronym, that is PTSI in this state, the Parent Educational Advocacy Training Center. So PTSI is funded by the federal government.
And every state has something like PTSI, and some bigger states have more than one.
Yeah. So that would be a huge resource impacted for
It
us.
would.
I know I personally have taken advantage of PTSI's services. I know many of us have.
Great webinars, the things that, yeah, their resources, absolutely.
Does anybody have any other questions for Laura? Oh, Kelly Henderson added in community parent resource centers like Formed Families Forward, that's where
Yes.
Kelly is
There
from.
are some subgrants that come out of there, and we're hoping all of that survives. I'd have to follow up. Hi, Kelly. I wondered if they got upped. So they pulled the PTI grant back in February, but they've reissued it and have them all reapplying. So thankfully the PTIs are out, meaning they're gonna at least give them 12 or 24 months of a program.
We did have another question come in about, will you share the slides?
I'm happy to. I'll send them to Sherry. She can share them with you, right? Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
I can even put my email. I'll put my email on the last slide if anybody wants to email me. So, but several of you know how to find me too. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Emily,
Laura,
I see you.
can I jump in with a question?
Yep.
Thanks so much. Hey, Laura, it's Michelle Cades. We often hear parents saying, what can I do?
Yeah.
Right. So my first question is, what can parents do when they're sort of feeling helpless about all of this?
Yeah.
And then the other question, and I apologize if you mentioned it, I'm in a little bit of information overload. What is being done in terms of the whole question of is this some of this stuff legal?
That's a really good question. Well, the administration thinks it is, so I don't speak for them, but I just know they're doing it, or they're pushing it so far to see how far they can go. There are many, many, many lawsuits. I think there's over 120 lawsuits just focused on the civil rights, education, kind of health nexus just in that space.
Right, thank you. And I do know that you did mention the 504 lawsuit earlier as well, I think.
Oh, and that's a separate one. So I
Oh,
mentioned
did you
the
not? Okay, I thought you
COPA.
did. Sorry.
So COPA has a lawsuit. You're right, they're different lawsuits. COPA has a lawsuit to sue OCR about them halting some of the investigations and closing their regional offices. And there's another lawsuit that where 17 attorney generals in red states are trying to eliminate a provision in a 504 regulation around gender dysmorphia. And that, is that how you say it? Sorry, I'm tired. And then
Dysphoria, but yes.
dysphoria. And in that process, they also said they just wanted to eliminate all of 504. So there's a stay in place right now, and I'm not an attorney. I'm just reporting what I heard in a meeting last week. And there's lots to read. So I'm going to put in here DREDF. Just Google DREDF 504, and they have this really amazing website page on their website that tells you all about this 504 lawsuit. And then COPAA.org, if you go to take action, so you have to put the www in there. We have alerts. So for your parents that want to do something, if they want to send an alert on Medicaid, don't cut Medicaid. If they want to send an alert to, and anybody can go in and do this. It's not like a member only thing. If they want to send an alert to say, don't dismantle ed, don't touch IDEA, don't block grant my money, our money for IDEA. If they want to do that, say no to that, they can also send an alert through COPA's website. And then the ARC, some of you are working with the ARC, they have all this, we all have alerts going, slightly different, messaging points based on our memberships and our areas of focus, but there's a lot of activity right now. They're both important, but Medicaid's the most topical and the most relevant, like in the next 2 weeks, that's the most important thing to be focused on.
Great, thank
I
you.
want to add to this. Virginia PTA does have a position statement that specifically supports increased Medicaid funding. It's related to poverty is the name. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. But we do have that available to us as a resource as PTA members to reference when we are advocating. I also mentioned in February that I was attending the legislative conference for National PTA. So in that work, I was on the Hill meeting with Senator Warner's office, Senator Kane's office, and also Representative Connolly's office. And we had discussions in each of those offices about Medicaid, about IDEA, and all of their staff are wanting to hear from their constituents. They are very much encouraging reaching out and sharing your story. As Michelle said, was asking, like, what can we do? That is something that our representatives are looking for. Out of the meeting with LightCon with Senator Kane, Senator Kane also reached out and ended up having a roundtable discussion in Fairfax County with Dr. Reed and other local leaders, including Debbie Kilpatrick, who I think is here tonight. She's our president of Fairfax County Council PTA. She and I were both present in that roundtable discussion to share our concerns regarding education with Senator Kane.
Yeah, let me, I'm actually just going to put like 3, I don't know how much this chat will let me put in, but here are 3 different places right there that want your stories. The first one is the Senate Energy and Commerce, the Democratic staff in the Senate. They've got a Google form where you go in and you can fill it out there. There's a story bank and then this Legal Action Center. Those are just 3 right there. Those are all focused on Medicaid if you want to share any of those. Yeah, and
Thank you
Deb's
so
talking
much.
about Tash. I haven't looked at Tash's stuff for a while, but I'm sure they're very active on this. Oh, I didn't know you were president-elect, Deb. Good for you. Anything else I can help you with? It got dark in my office while I was talking. Sorry about that. My other little lamp doesn't work, but it's dark in here. Got dark.
Ellie, I see you putting your camera on. Do you have a question? Emily Sachdev, I saw you putting it on. Do you have a question? Okay. Just making sure.
Just letting you have some people with you.
Appreciate that. All right. Does anybody else have any other questions for the evening? Yes, I am saving the chat and we will share the links when we share the slides. The links that Laura just shared.
Well, good luck with everything, and
Thank
I
you,
will
Laura.
follow up with the slide deck in a PDF. And
Thank you.
feel free to reach out if something comes up as you keep doing your good work.
Thank you so much, Laura. We really appreciate your
Thank
time
you.
tonight. I
Thank
think
you.
like Michelle, my brain is in a little bit of information overload.
I know
Um,
it's a lot to take in. I went really fast, but I
No,
didn't want to
it's
keep you here all night either. So
it's great information though. And yes, we will share the recording. So hopefully that will be up soon. We recorded only this portion of the meeting specifically, so we wouldn't need to do much editing. So we will get that up as soon as we can. And thank you so much again, Laura, for your time and your expertise in sharing everything that you have this evening. And thank you all to everybody who came out and joined us.
thank you. Everybody take care.
Have a great night, everybody.